Hello again, welcome back everyone. Liquorhound here with you. Thank you for joining me once again for another spirit review video. And today we're going to be taking a look at sherried whiskeys, almost like a sherried 101 class, where we talk a little bit about the different styles of sherries that are used in the maturation of whiskeys, whether it be Oloroso, PX, and then the lesser used Amontillado and Fino. We're going to talk about the difference between first fill, second fill, the differences between maturation, full maturation in sherry versus finishing techniques in sherry, and so on. Now, first and foremost, the majority of sherried whiskeys that you see out there on the shelves are going to have some color to them. You know, they're going to have this redder hue that you'll see here in pretty much all of these. That's the first telltale sign. When you see that redder color, it's usually going to mean it's sherry matured whiskey or sherry finished whiskey. Now, the dark red, now the only I say usually because some distilleries will still use coloring, so we have to be careful here. The majority are getting away from it. Even Bowmore used to use it on some, and they're kind of pulling back from that. They're stopped coloring their whiskey simply because it's kind of a stigma now where you don't want to be known as that guy that is coloring his whiskey, making it look pretty or making it look appealing to the consumer just based on color. All right. So a lot of these, the majority of these, are naturally colored whiskeys. The other thing to note is that the sherry cask that's giving it that color, the reason it's happening is because that sherry has that red hue to begin with. Sherry being a fortified wine, the majority of the ones that are used, the type of sherry that is used for maturation of whiskeys is Oloroso sherry. So when you go and you look on your liquor store shelves and you see those sherried whiskeys, I'd probably say 90–95% of them are Oloroso matured. Every now and then, I know Kilchoman has done it. I know this Bowmore has a little PX sherry. There's a few that use Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. Now, the PX sherry is going to be a sweeter style. So it's going to give not only a sweeter taste to the whiskey itself, it's also going to give a little more viscosity because you're going to translate that sugar as viscosity, okay? Now, the lesser used are going to be stuff like Amontillado or Fino sherry. Those are just rarely used casks, but they do happen every now and then, usually in the higher end spirits. I know Lafroig did the Carchus Amontillado a couple years back. Really nice, leaned more on the fresher fruits, the orchard type fruits for me, and I really enjoyed that one. As far as the Fino sherry, the Macallan Fino that I reviewed a couple back was a great example of a really nice Fino sherry. Now, Fino sherry is usually typically a drier style, so you're not going to impart that sweetness or viscosity, so you usually have to start out with a really nice distillate. And then the Fino cask itself is very expensive, so that's how come a lot of times they don't do that very often. All right, now the other thing about the first fill, second fill, or the full maturation versus finishing is great examples would be with these Springbanks that I have right here. Now this is Springbank 17 sherry wood. This was entirely matured in sherry casks. Now the difference is that this was a batch. So there was several sherry butts and hogsheads, both fresh and refill sherry that imparted this color to this whiskey. Springbank does not color, so that is the natural color. Now every now and then you'll see a Springbank 17 single cask. This is fresh fill or first fill sherry, much darker in color, and that is because that sherry barrel had never been used for any other whiskey. This was the first time, so it imparted all its flavor, all that sherry that was trapped in that wood, because again, just like whiskey, when sherry is being aged in oak, it gets into the wood, impregnates that wood, and then when they dump that sherry, there's still sherry trapped in that wood. So when they put in the whiskey and the whiskey begins to breathe, it goes into the wood and extracts the sherry into the whiskey. So you get that red hue, you get that coloring. Now with refill sherry, that means that's already had a whiskey in their aging. They dumped it, and then they refilled it with more whiskey, so you're going to get less impact of that sherry because it's already given a lot of its influence to that first whiskey. So the more times they use it, the lesser the impact of the sherry is going to be on the whiskey. All right. So whenever you're out there looking, there's a lot of independent bottlers out there that'll do sherried whiskey, and it'll say refill hogshead or refill sherry, first fill sherry. You know that the first fill is going to be the most impactful as far as like the heavily sherry feel. That's going to be those red fruits, those dark fruits, dried fruits. That's what's giving you all that. and usually is sweetness. Sherry is sweeter fortified wine, so you're going to get a little sweeter style than a typical just ex-bourbon barrel matured whiskey. All right. Now, last but not least, the only negative to sherried whiskeys that occasionally pops up is sulfur. And you'll hear people talk about different levels of sulfur compounds in whiskeys. Sometimes it's as light as, let's say, a burnt matchstick or a little gunpowder residue, and sometimes it's as bad as like rotten eggs or bile in some cases. And when it gets to that level of bile and rotten eggs, I'm out. I don't like those compounds in my whiskeys, and that's just too much for me, and I don't like those. So I look at those as flaws or drawbacks, negatives. To whereas if it's just a little burnt matchstick or a little gunpowder, that's an element, that's a component to that whiskey. Mortlock's a great example of that, because that distillery tends to always have a little bit of a sulfur element to that, and there's a good reason for that. And we'll talk about that right now, because a lot of people want to point blame at the cask. It's the sherry cask that's giving that sulfur. It's the sherry candles. You hear that a lot, thrown out a lot. I think it's a combination of a lot of things. First and foremost, sherry will create sulfur as a natural compound in the sherry itself, because anytime you ferment, you're going to get sulfur compounds. So when that sherry is being fermented in those casks, it's creating a little sulfur. Also, the whiskey itself, when the whiskey's being fermented and that barley's being converted, that starch conversion is going with the yeast, a byproduct is sulfur. So you'll get a little sulfur in there. Now, typically, when it's distilled, the copper pot or the copper tubing itself will almost act like a filter for those sulfur compounds. So they'll either adhere to the copper or it'll neutralize those compounds as they go through, and then they put it in the barrel, and the barrel itself will also filter and kind of eliminate those sulfur compounds the majority of times. Now, back to Mortlock. Mortlock does not use copper tubing. They use, I think, stainless steel tubes. So you'll get a little bit of that element of that sulfur coming through, but it's almost like I believe it's almost like a purposely done thing. Like that is their signature. And as long as, again, it's just a little burnt matchstick or gunpowder, we're all good. That is greatness. But that's what you're going to notice out there. Different levels. If you get those elements, that's sulfur. It's not necessarily a bad thing. The other thing about those sulfur candles, a lot of people think it's the sulfur candles that they're burning inside the casks, because whenever they dump a sherry barrel and say they're going to transport it overseas, or they know it's not going to be used for a long time, they want to disinfect that barrel. So they'll use sulfur candles on the inside to disinfect. And some people think, well, it's that residue, and they don't rinse them out properly, and then they add the whiskey, and that's what gives it the sulfur. Could be. But again, we just covered all the bases. Could be a lot of things. But all that said, the majority of the time, sherried whiskeys just add another element to a traditional distilled whiskey that adds those dried fruits, those red fruits, those sweet characteristics, those usually like baking spices, that type of thing, usually comes on from the sherry into the whiskey. All right. Now, again, you'll hear me sometimes talk about sherry bombs. Sherry bombs to me are when they're heavily sherried, like this Glendronich 18 or the Aberlour A'bunadh. Those are sherry bombs. I might consider the Balvenie 15 sherry cask, depending on which one you actually select. So let's go ahead and go to the very beginning. Glendronich 18, the Allardyce. That one is now discontinued, sadly. So if you see it out there, it's the last of its kind for a while, that is. The Glendronich 15, the Revival, again, same thing, discontinued because Glendronich is going to no age statements as they've done here in the Cask Strength, which when you taste this, it's almost a combination of the 12, 15, and 18, all right? Next up, the Macallan 12. Now, the Macallan 12 and the Macallan 18 are pretty unique in that the 18-year-old is really good, but it is fairly expensive at around $250. The Macallan 12, lesser so at around $40 to $60. But if you can find the old Macallans, the ones that are dark, like that, that's the one to buy. Because nowadays when you go and you look at the store, you'll see them about like this color, which is not nearly as dark. And you also notice on the back of the new ones, it'll say importing by Edrington Americas. So the importer is Edrington Group, which is the new owner. And that happened in 2014. And the new ones are much lighter. They're not as heavily sherried. I prefer the older ones, so if you can find the older ones, go with those. Again, they will have that dark color on the 12s, and the price is right at around $40, hopefully $50. All right, leaving the 18, Aberlour A'bunadhs, the batch 45 and the batch 50. They all come in different batches, but 45 was a tremendous batch. Batch 50 was pretty nice. I actually have batch 47 as well. That was also really good. I've found them all be pretty good. There's only a couple batches. I think, let's say batch 46 wasn't so good. But if you're really concerned about it, just Google it and you'll find the best batches for Aberlour A'bunadh. Now, the next up, the Balvenie single cask sherry, 15-year-old. Again, beautiful whiskey. But look at the color. When you're in the store and you look at the color, it's very similar to the Macallan 12. There's going to be two out there. There's going to be a darker one and a lighter one. The lighter one is a refill sherry, and it does not say on the bottle anywhere that it's refill sherry or first fill. But I have it under very, very solid, good authority that they did bottle both refill and first fill sherry casks for the Balvenie 15. So you want to make sure and get the darker ones, because those are the good ones. Those, and I have the lighter ones, the refill, and they're not there. They're drinkers, you'll drink them, but they're not nearly as good as the first fill. Lastly, the Bowmore. I wanted to have one that was Islay representative, one that's fairly new, still out there. The Bowmore, the Devil's Cask, 3rd edition. This is an Islay whiskey that is both aged in Oloroso and PX sherry. So you're getting that sweet salt, from the brine, and probably that smoky character from that Islay whiskey. So if you like Ardbeg, Ugadal, something like that, this is going to be right up your alley. The only negative to this is the price increase that happened recently. I've seen them retailing as high as $250, but I think if you look around, you can probably find them less. I know here in Texas, they were running about $115. So yes, I know, incredible price difference. All right, now let's go ahead and pile drive real quickly through the nosing and tasting. Glendronich, 18-year-old, the sherry bomb. When you nose it right away, it's just big sherry. And if you ever want to know what sherry tastes like, go to your local wine store, liquor store. Oloroso sherry is very inexpensive. You can get a $10 bottle and go home and just see what it tastes like, see what PX tastes like. And then you'll know the differences. Now, you're probably not going to drink a whole bottle. They're pretty sweet. But you'll be able to immediately recognize the nose and the taste. So on the 18, dried fruits, raisins, figs, and plums, cinnamon, clove, a fair amount of clove, chocolate, and leather, I would say on this one. A little bit of dried orange peel. The 15-year-old, the Glendronich Revival, more vanilla. This one's a little fresher on the fruits. No, not so much dried fruits. More on the orchard apricot and the red berries. On this one, the vanilla driving, cinnamon, a little bit lesser on the clove, and a little bit of leather, but not nearly as much as the 18. Glendronich Cask Strength. Very similar to the 15. Actually a little more muted on the nose, but it's almost identical aromatics, just lesser impact, with the exception of the alcohol heat. I can tell it is cask strength because it does want to back me out of the glass, but almost identical. Vanilla, the mix of red fruits, a little bit of dried fruits, the cinnamon, a little bit of clove, and a little bit of leather, maybe even chocolate. Yeah, we'll leave the chocolate out of it. All right, the Macallan 12. Let me do a little coffee bean because I knew this was going to be kind of rough on the nose, all these sherried whiskeys. The Macallan 12, this was bottled in 2006. Again, if you find the older ones, it's the one to go with. So 2006, you're talking about what, 94 distillate? Oh, this one's nice. So it's very, it's got the sherry. It almost comes off like a sherry bomb, but it's very well integrated. So we're getting the dried fruits, almost a hint of a floral element to it as well, with a vanilla custardy aspect on the nose. The cinnamon and clove are in here, but they're very well balanced in with all the fruits up front. Some chocolate, almost fudge. And a little bit of leather and dried orange peel. Really nice for that Macallan 12 for a $40 bottle. The Macallan 18. Okay. Similar to the 12. A little more bump up on the cinnamon. They're exactly the same proof. 86 proof. But this one's a little more hotter on the cinnamon. The clove is there. There's more mulling spices on this one. Dried orange peels. A little bit of that floralness, but it's a little bolder than that 12. That 12 seemed very seamless. All right, Aberlour, the Cask Strength Batch 45, 60.2 proof. Wow, big vanilla. The closest thing is the Glendronich Revival 15 with the vanilla note, but this is Cask Strength. Red fruits, red berries, raspberries and cherries. Maybe a little bit of fig in this one. Maybe even a little strawberry in this one. Again, that vanilla driving underneath. Cinnamon is pretty popping. Clove as well. Allspice, some nuttiness to this one. All right. Now the batch 50. And when you see them out there, like I said, I've seen batch 42 recently, and I've seen batch 54, so they're all over the place, but 45 is a really good one. All right, very similar to 45 for batch 50. The only difference is the cinnamon and the spice notes a little bumped up, and the oak feels a little bit more resounding, a little more resin coming through on the oak, with a little bit of earthiness to that wood. Think mushrooms, but the orange peels are still in here as well. All right, Balvenie. All right, so the Balvenie, single cask 15, first fill. Oh, that's nice. So this one actually has a lot of spice element coming through, a lot of vanilla, almost, I almost want to call it caramel. But the sherry influence here is a lot of red fruits, berries, and I would call this one probably, again, dark cherries on this one. Cinnamon, clove, allspice, almost baking spices here. Some almond oil coming through, so you're almost getting like some almond nuances to it. But the spices feel sweet and yet exotic, so you're getting a big mixture of spices coming through on that one. It does have some similarities to its bigger and more expensive brother, the Balvenie Ton 1401 series. There's some elements of that in here, so I could see how if you age this a little more, you could probably put it in with that blend. Of course, those are gone. Now we're at the 1509s. They're not nearly as sherried. And last but not least, Bowmore, the Devil's Cask 3. Oh, yeah. This has got a really rich sweetness from that PX sherry. You're getting a smoky brineness right away with smoked meats, almost like bacon or pork. And then you're combining that with the fruitiness of the Oloroso and the PX sherry, so you're getting dates and figs. Wow, very, very sweet. Almost like rose petals for a second there. Almost a floral note. But the majority of it reminds me of like the little appetizers where you get the candied dates that are wrapped with bacon. That's pretty much what that smells like. Really, really nice. All right, now we're going to get to the tasting. Well, one last thing before we get to tasting. So sherry, back before the 80s, there used to be a method that was occasionally used by Macallan and a few others that was called pajarit. So pajarit was a method where you would cook down sherry. So you'd almost like thicken the sherry or make like a sherry syrup. And then you would pour that, once you dump the sherry out, you'd pour that in the barrel and pressurize the barrel or roll it around, get it to just get into the wood, and then you would dump out whatever's excess, and then they'd fill out with the whiskey. There was pros and cons. A pro, you got really flavorful whiskey, and it was also very, very dark, like this one. It's a Macallan from 1983. That is dark. Now, again, when you taste whiskeys like this, you're going to immediately notice a difference between that and everything else here. But that's simply because some of that may have contained that pajarit method. So it was good and bad. It was good in that it was flavorful whiskey. It was bad in that it's almost like a little trick they were playing. So they didn't want to do that anymore. So in the 80s, they discontinued it, made it against the law. That's how come we don't see whiskeys like that very often. But like I said, they were great. So I don't know where I fall on that fence. I mean, it was tremendous. Anyway, all right, to the tasting. Glendronich, 18-year-old, 92 proof, if I remember correctly. Yep. Wow. Very rich on the dark fruits. Almost feels port-like with those dark fruit entry. Heavy on the oak, because I'm already getting the oak resin on the mid palate. Dates and plums, raisins, chocolate, oak. Right, like I said, oak's already showing up on the mid palate. The chocolate is leading into leather, and then the leather is only getting dusted with dark cocoa powder, so it's very, very big, very, very strong whiskey. Good flavor, it's just heavy and dark. Next up, the Glendronich, the Revival. '15-year, just as I mentioned before. Wow. It does lean a little less away from those dark fruits. You're getting more on the red fruits, the red richness of the sherry right up front. The vanilla is driving throughout. There is a wood note, an oak, that comes through again. It kind of comes to a little early, almost just after the mid palate here. But the cinnamon and clove are a pretty big swell on that mid palate. Good malty character. Cinnamon clove growing, oak coming in just afterwards, but not feeling nearly as old or as heavy. Good balance, a little spicy, but overall a really nice balance for the 15. When I used to drink these two, I used to actually blend a little bit of each because I kind of felt they would have been best right in between. So 16, 17-year-old Glendronich probably would have been spot on. All right, Glendronich Cask Strength Batch 3. Let's see. And it is exactly what I was describing on the nose. Very similar to the 15, a little bit of the 18. Wow. Right after the mid palate actually enters, and it's very fruit forward, and you start getting the apricot and maybe a little of those berries and all that. And then you get that cinnamon and clove coming in very nicely, similar to the 15. Vanilla starts running in, and then all of a sudden, right after that cinnamon and clove come in, it takes a dive, and you actually can start tasting some of the 18 in it. You start getting those darker fruits. You start getting that old leather. And that cocoa powder on the finish of that one. He's like, he's like the best of both worlds there. Not quite as rich as the other two, but it's a good combination. You're getting the feel of both at a higher cask strength. You could probably add a few drops of water to that and really bring it where it should be. Macallan 12 from 2006, 86 proof. Oh, what a drinker. So right away, It's just so well-rounded. It's sherry whiskey, but it's malt. The malt whiskey is coming through, and it's just blending again seamlessly. The dark fruits, the fresh red berries, mixed perfectly balanced. Chocolate, milk chocolate, almost like fudge. Roasted nuts, coffee beans. But the red fruits don't die out. They're still rolling into the finish. Perfect amount of oak, not over oaked, not feeling heavy. Just very, very, so juicy, so nice right there. Spot on for that Macallan 12. All right. The Macallan, 18 year, bottled in 94, distilled in 94, bottled in 2012. Okay, now that's nice. This was great. For $40, this was tremendous. This is really good, but it's $250. I don't know if it's that much better, but it is more complex. I am getting more spices to it. It is getting more mulling spices in with the cinnamon, clove, and allspice as well. Like it almost has nutmeg. Dried orange peel. That chocolate is in there as well. Again, fudge-like here. Not really cocoa powder. Oak coming in at the very back with leather. It's always good. 18 is always good. It's just a matter of price. That's the only thing that kind of worries me sometimes on it. And I don't want their quality to drop any more than that right there. I think that's about as... For an 18-year-old, that's $250. That's about as far as I want it to get. Away from where it was. You know what I mean? All right. Aberlour A'bunadh, 45. Reminds me of the Glendronich Cask Strength. Red fruits, dried fruits, figs, dates. But big, heavy vanilla coming through. Almost feeling like caramel. Maybe almost a hint of molasses. Cocoa powder. A little tobacco leaf, a little leather on the finish. Cinnamon swells just right. It doesn't come off like 60.2. It does not drink like that. But it's just intense. It's a sherry bomb. You know, the sherry bomb, again, Glendronich 18 and these. But these are huge because of that cask strength quality. The finish just goes on and on. It's ridiculous. I'm going to cut that short because this video is too long. Okay. Batch 50. Okay, great example. Little bit of sulfur in the 50. That earthiness that I was picking up on the palate, on the nose, is coming through on the palate as mushrooms, darker oak, almost not quite musty, but it's a little earthiness to that oak, like an old barrel. Everything else exactly the same as the 45, but there's some sulfur that comes through on the mid palate, and it comes through as a little bit of like burnt matches. That's how that one comes through. So it's not a lot, but it is there. So we're gonna see how that progresses. I know oxidation usually will kind of help that. Sometimes I've heard of people decanting the whiskey to help get rid of that. This one's not horrible. It's actually just an element, so I'm not gonna mess with that one. But that's in there. All right, so next up, Balvenie, 15-year-old single cask, 15. Wow, yep, that's great. Totally different than everyone else. The only one that's even similar is the 18. because of the spices. Just like it knows exotic spices. Spice market. You're walking around and you're just getting that sweet multitude of spices coming through the air. That's what comes through on the glass. Even has floral elements as well to go along with the red fruits that are popping. Oh, and there's the Balvenie typical honey malt that usually comes through a lot of times, shows up on the mid palate. And not only that, it actually leads you right into some leather, some really nice leather. And then the oak is just waiting for you on the very back end. Really, really nicely done. I will say this bottle needs to oxidize as well. I remember when I first opened it, wasn't quite there. It needed some time to just kind of relax. It was a little too spicy initially. Now those spices have subdued and it is just perfectly balanced. That would fit in with the Balvenie 1401 line, the ton line, tremendously. On the finish, that's great. Prime example. Just because the whiskey boom has happened, there's not like there's not great whiskeys out there. You know, every time you start thinking like, are the good days gone? No, there's still great whiskeys. The Octomore 6.3 came out. There's some really good ones still popping out. Bowmore's Devil Cast. Let's see how this one's coming through. Wow, very viscous. That PX sherry, that sweetness is coming through on the palate. And just like it knows, dates, figs, smoked meats, brininess coming through. Wow, and the fruits. It's more like, there's those dates and figs, but there's also some red fruits. Vanilla coming through as well. Chocolate. That is a great whiskey that is well balanced. There's a good amount of spice. I mean, it is high proof, 56.7. That's 113.4 proof. That is a big whiskey. The cinnamon swell is the only give to that. And only like the tail, it's when cinnamon kind of bumps up right there in the mid palate. That's the only way you know it's that proof. But other than that, tremendously well done whiskey. Again, at 115, I highly recommend it. At 250, I don't know. There's some really good whiskeys out there for 250. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. I know it was tremendously long. Apologize for that. But keep leaving those great comments. Everybody have a great evening and cheers.